Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 11th chapter in the book of Jeremiah. Here we read of two conspiracies, the first of which was to undermine the covenantal reforms of the revivalist, the last and final godly king on the throne of Judah, Josiah. And we read of a conspiracy against Jeremiah's life. So his life was on the line. He really paid the price of being a prophet. And the first conspiracy emerges in the context of the covenant forsaken. Judah had forsaken their covenant, and the consequences and warnings are given in that covenant, but to Jeremiah is revealed the more prophetic detail, which elaborates something more specific to its fulfillment. But the 10th chapter, the preceding chapter, the chapter we're going to review before we launch into the lesson itself, it compares and contrasts the Yahweh, the one, the only, the true and unique Elohim, to the idols of the Gentiles. So these are the ways of the Gentiles that Jeremiah is instructed to teach, to preach, that we should not learn these ways. For the prescribed customs of these peoples are worthless. For one cuts a tree from the forest and work for the hand of a craftsman with a cutting tool. They adorn it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers so that it does not topple. They are like rounded posts, and they do not speak. They have to be carried because they do not walk. Do not be afraid of them, for they do no evil, nor is it in them to do any good. So these idols are inanimate objects. They don't have the power to save. They don't have the power to hear. You can pray to them, but you're praying to a piece of wood. You may fancy it up with gold and silver, but it's still an item of the earth. You are worshiping the creation rather than the creator. And so the Gentiles didn't know any better, but the tragedy was that Judah and Israel before it had succumbed to they had learned the ways of the Gentile. The temptation was all around them, and eventually we read in the chapter we're going to cover today that there were as many idols as there were towns in Judah. But verse 5, there is none like you, O Yahweh. You are great, and great is your name in might. Who would not fear you, O King of the nations? For this is your due among all the wise men of the nations, and in their kings there is none like you. In their kingdoms there is none like you. So he is unique. He is he is the eternal creator of all that is, the invisible creator of everything that is. He is omnipotent. He is omnipresent. He is omniscient. So those are attributes which speak of his perfect intelligence, wisdom, and presence. Maybe not in that order. But there's no comparison because these idols are literally have no metaphysical substance outside of the physical edifices on which they are created. So there's no comparison between an idol, which is nothing more than an inanimate object of wood and clay or gold, the work of men's hand, whereas we are the works of his hand, as he communicates in the 4th chapter. But fear and reverence is our obligation and due. This is his due among all the wise men. So if we are wise, and in whatever nation we belong to, this is not to Israel alone, we will be wise to submit to the superior spiritual entity, the maker and mover and manager, creator and controller of all that moves and is and lives. But Yahweh is truly Elohim. He is the living Elohim and the everlasting King. At his wrath the earth shakes, and nations are unable to stand his displeasure. So he's alive, he's eternally alive. Men will die, and men will die from his wrath. At the execution and the issuing of his wrath, the entire earth trembles and shakes, and no nation, no army of human or angelic beings can resist the execution of his wrath. So he is a completely sovereign being. When he is determined to issue his wrathful retribution, he will do so, and there's nothing you can do about it. No one can get in the way. There comes a time when you sin away your day of grace, and that's certainly what we witnessed Judah, as we witnessed take place earlier to Israel. He made the earth by his power. He has established the world by his wisdom, and has stretched out the heavens by his understanding. So power, wisdom, and understanding, these are the ingredients of creation, and these attributes belong intrinsically to him. He is an omnipotent, that means all-powerful, and omniscient, all-knowing being, and the existence of creation implies an intelligent design to it, because too much adds up, too much makes sense. The physical universe clearly operates in accordance to rational principles this is all the evidence we need that there is an intelligent design to creation. But more than that, he was powerful enough to execute the perfect plan that he conceived in his mind, and he stretched out the entire heavens by his understandings. All the stars in the sky are his. He has billions, and yet on this pale blue dot exists the cosmic struggle of good and evil, of heaven and hell. Now he speaks less flatteringly of the idols. They are worthless, a work of mockery. In the time of their punishment they perish. The portion of Jacob is not like these, for he is the maker of all, and Israel is the tribe of his inheritance. Yahweh of hosts is his name. So even though he created all the nations, all the people, Israel was specially selected to be his chosen people. They had a divine providential purpose to be a witness and a light to the Gentiles. Israel did not measure up terribly well on their report card. They could not even create the conditions for the covenantal blessings which would give a witness to them. They squandered it away by succumbing to the ways of the Gentile, which is idolatry. And verse 21 speaks of the dereliction of duty of people entrusted to spiritual authority. For the shepherds have become brutish, and they have not sought Yahweh. Therefore they did not understand, and all their flocks scattered. So brutish, that word is described in several of the verses we didn't even read, just looking over here, verse 8. But there's also at least verse 14, it appears once more. So brutish, the fool in his heart says that there is no God. And the fool, as the scripture defines it, is not one who is mentally deficient, but morally so. And as shepherds, as pastors, as people entrusted to the spiritual welfare of others, we do not have the luxury to be foolish, because we have to exemplify what we want to be the exponent of us. So if we are not living in the covenant ways, we are not spreading the covenant ways, or if we are not living by grace through faith, then we cannot set the example. We are going to be scattering people if we lead them astray, and we want to be gathering. We're in the business of gathering people, keeping them all together till the end, so they can meet us up there in heaven one day. Now the first verse of the 11th chapter, this is the lesson itself. The word that came to Jeremiah from Yahweh, saying... So the thing we learn first off is this word is not Jeremiah's. He is the hand which wrote it, but the source which inspired it, the source from which it emanates, is Yahweh himself. And the writing of it, the recording of it, would of course been inspired by the Ruach Kadesh. But this is the word. He is the prophet, and the prophet proclaims the word. They are the recipients of the word. They are the human vessels of the divine plan and will and character. And what does Yahweh say? Hear the words of this covenant, and speak to the men of Judah and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So here, that word appears frequently in the prophetic proclamations, and it's the first word we hear of Yahweh's mouth, and this is to listen as if you were in a courtroom, because the covenant entails obligations and expectations for the blessings, and consequences and curses for our failure to honor our end of it. So this message is for Judah. They were the one covenant nation left. There was one covenant people, even though there was two kingdoms. Israel went away before Judah, because all their kings were invariably idolaters. So idolatry is the sin which leads to every other sin, because once we detach ourselves from our infallible moral compass, all bets are off in every aspect of our faith. That's why they were wandering sheep going astray, the nation of Judah, at this point, because they did not obey the words of the covenant. They had it, but the possession of the word or the Bible or the covenant or anything else is not a substitute for the practice thereof. So if we possess it, we have to practice it. Which I commanded your fathers in the day when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, from the iron furnace, saying, Obey my voice, and you shall do according to all that I command you, and you shall be my people, and I shall be your Elohim. So this covenant was nothing new. It was at least as old as Sinai. This is where Moses in Exodus 19 through 24 received the terms of the covenant, the Ten Commandments, everything else, the governing body of rules by which the Israelites were to live in their daily lives and in their worship lives. Just every aspect was contained in this covenant and demanded obedience, because it was the voice. This is the voice. We have the access to the voice of divinity in the pages of this book, and we have to obey what we hear. and do according to all that I command you. So if you break one sin, you break them all. This is the message communicated in James 2:10, and these are the conditions to be belonging to him. When we belong to him, he belongs to us. So we are his people, and he is our Elohim. And that's an unbreakable bond. Anything we belong to belongs to us. So when we belong to him, no devil can steal our dreams or penetrate our spiritual armor when we are shielded in him. In order to establish the oath which I have sworn to your father, to give them a land, to give them a land flowing with milk and honey, as it is this day. And I answered and said, Amen, Yahweh. So the covenant was, they were given a promised land, and they were given a covenant even before they entered into it, according to which they were to live their lives, to prepare them to possess this land of milk and honey. But they came out of the iron furnace, and it is in the furnace of affliction and with persecution that, there's something about the pain and the discipline of it that just brings out the best in us. But as soon as they got to the land of milk and honey, and even on their way over there, they kind of faltered, but the promise remained inviolate, and they were explicitly warned in the covenant that he would uproot them for prolonged failure. So he is long-suffering, and he had preserved and protected them this far, but Jeremiah would witness the destruction and conquest of his beloved Jerusalem in his own lifetime. And Yahweh said to me, Proclaim all these words in the city of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem, saying, Hear the words of this covenant and do them. So to proclaim, we read that word in the second chapter, second verse, third chapter, 12th verse. That is to publicly proclaim. It's another way of saying preach, witness. Jeremiah was a preacher, and he did proclaim all these words to in the public, in the street. He was the weeping prophet who, he wasn't a prosperity gospel megastar of a super church. And one of the lessons we have to extract from Jeremiah is that our worthiness of ministers is not contingent on our ability to attract crowds, but to faithfully proclaim the message we are given. And the reception or lack thereof is ultimately not up to us. That does not absolve us of the responsibility, even though it might have been easier to win people to salvation in an earlier age. There's a lot of hostility and hatred for Christianity, but we are still called to spread the message without fear and obey the voice. And so, having heard the words of the covenant, they are now bound to do them. And there were blessings in exchange. The covenant was a system of reward and punishments, because Israel was in a spiritually immature state. So they would be rewarded with temporal and spiritual prosperity in exchange for obedience, and hit with curses. One of the curses we read in the 12th chapter was famine, and it emanated from the wicked people on top, yet the innocent people had to suffer because their rulers and shepherds were blind leading the blind straight into exile. For I earnestly warned your father in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt until this day, rising early in warning, saying, Obey my voice. So he had made his voice known. He had made his voice known loud and clear. He had made his voice known repeatedly, rising early. And this had been his constant message since the Exodus generation, when he brought them up out of the land of Egypt. So Israel's identity springs from being a people redeemed from slavery, much in the same way that the chosen people of the new covenant, we are redeemed from sin. And we, once having been redeemed, that does not give us license to relapse into the sin we are being saved from, but the same message to them is the same message to us: obey my voice. But they did not obey or incline their ear, but everyone walked in the stubbornness of his evil heart. So I brought on them all the words of this covenant, which I commanded them to do, and they did not do. So in the final and ultimate analysis, they have no one to blame but themselves, because he had issued the warnings and the consequences, and they had it all spelled out and for them. And the word that, as Moses said, was not so high in the heavens that it is beyond outer reach. It is in this book. It is written down. The word of divinities can be contained in a book in a documentary form. but our hearts can get in the way. And Jeremiah, people who think with their hearts are following Satan's designs and strategies, because his diagnosis of the human heart is in 17:19. It is three things. It is manipulative or deceitful above all else, and it is deeply depraved, intrinsically so, desperately wicked, and incomprehensible. Who can understand it? So the human heart thinks that they are doing good when they are doing bad by its very manipulative nature. God gave you a brain for a reason. He wants you to use it. Satan wants you to think with your heart, because if you follow the stubbornness of your heart, the human heart, the unredeemed heart, is wicked and intrinsically and irreversibly so until the new life is implanted in this. But they had no one to blame for the visitation of the curses and consequences of which they had been amply forewarned morning and day. And Yahweh said to me, there is a conspiracy among the men of Judah and among the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the dating of the material in the 11th and 12th chapter is believed to correspond with the reign of Josiah. The conspiracy that he referenced, I alluded to earlier in the passage, or in the lesson, was the conspiracy to undermine the reforms of Josiah, the last godly king of Judah. This places us before the year 509 BM, before Messiah. That's the year in which he died, or 597, I think. Sorry about the confusion. But there was, in fact, a conspiracy because the house of David, the dynasty of David, fluctuated between reformers and revivalists and idolaters. So as soon as the reforms went up, the idolatrous edifices would be torn back from the land. Then their idolatrous son would rise to the throne, and they would tear down the covenant and erect idols in the temple of all places. But Josiah was one of the good ones, and of course there were the rulers that were, the powers that were, the people who had interest to protect were not invested in the restoration of the covenant. They were determined to profit at the decline of their own nation. They have turned back to the wickedness of their forefathers who refused to hear my words, and they have gone after other mighty ones to serve them. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have broken my covenant I made with their fathers. So even though Israel beat them to it, they were already in exile. This was an accomplished fact, at least a century old at the rate, more than that, 722 BM. But what happened to them eventually happened to Judah. And so Judah, even as they witnessed Israel, they thought that they deserved it, but nothing could happen to them. They had the false sense of assurance and presumption that they were entitled to live in and rule this land of milk and honey that was given to their fathers, but it was given on the condition of covenantal obligations. So they could squander their inheritance for their progeny by being the final link. And he was long suffering for them all this time. And in fact, the duration of the exile was determined by the number of sabbatical years they had reaped the soil without letting the land low foul. We can read of that in Leviticus 25. But they just didn't want to hear. They rejected. They refused to admit. It didn't register. His words went in one ear and out the other. It did not saturate their minds, their souls, or their wills, because they were distracted by the proliferation of other mighty ones, rival deities, the ones they were expressly forbidden to worship. Idolatry was a big no-no, but it was literally all around them, so the warning was there because they would be tempted to succumb to the ways of the Gentiles, as they often did. Therefore, thus said Yahweh, see, I am bringing evil on them, which they are unable to escape, and they shall cry out to me, but I shall not listen to them. So they have no one to blame but themselves once more for the evil that is inflicted on them. They could have avoided this regrettable scenario by repenting and restoring the covenant and getting right with the covenant maker. But there's going to be no escape it, and the innocent are going to perish along with the guilty. So they were collectively guilty. They were to be judged as a nation. There were some innocent people in it. Jeremiah had to suffer even while Judah was still he was a sackcloth preacher living as an ascetic in Jerusalem, just a street preacher, one of the people we kind of look disdainfully upon in contemporary Christianity. It's the last place you want to be when you are a preacher, but he was very much there. He was in the front lines, trench warfare of the fate of his nation, and they rejected his message to repent. And now when you sin, then that means why should he listen to you when the first thing you do is pray to these inanimate objects of earthly composition, and they do not answer you? So they were using him as an emergency crutch. They had foul weather faith. There was no foxhole atheists. There were no foxhole idolaters when the visitation of the calamity came. So they all knew that they should be worshiping the one who had accomplished their redemption, but they were distracted and they succumbed to temptation. And they had no one to blame but themselves for, their pride and possession as a nation was Yahweh, but, they didn't listen to him, so they did not make the most of him. And the cities of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem shall go and cry out to the mighty ones to whom they burn incense, but they shall bring no salvation to them at all in the day of their evil. So it is folly to ascribe any divine estimation to any creation of man's hands. So these idols, once more, they had no metaphysical substance save that which existed in people's imaginations. And the people of Judah, who were specially related, they had special revelation. The Gentiles did not have the word of Yahweh. They did not have the law. They did not have the covenant. But they nevertheless indulged in burning incense to foreign mighty ones, that is just a rival deity, the ones who did not procure their redemption and could not accomplish their salvation in their hour of need. So they turn to the idols once Yahweh's ear is shut off, as well as use him as once the idols don't answer their prayer. For your mighty ones have become as many as your cities, O Judah, and you have put up as many altars to shame as there are streets in Jerusalem, altars to burn incense to Baal. So the premise of polytheism was that there was, a deity for every element in nature, the wind, the moon, the sun, light, everything there was, water and fertility, and there was also deities for every geographical jurisdiction. The people who worship the gods of their own choosing, those gods were thought to be the omnipotent ones in their respective jurisdiction, but their jurisdiction was limited. So when they have the temple in Jerusalem, which should be, there were idolatry had been set up shop by a lot of the wicked, iniquitous kings. But this was just, in every household there was these idols. So I think even pagans used to pray to household gods that they carried around. They were portable. And, Baal was the worst of the worst. He was the storm deity, the patron of which was Jezebel, the most notorious and wicked woman in the Old Testament, perhaps. Her name survives as a figure of ridicule and reproach that is applied by John in the book of Revelation to a few heretics of that age. That is the worst thing you can call someone. And Elijah courageously confronted the prophets of Baal in the Mount of Carmel in the 19th chapter of the first book of Kings, and he calls on fire and then he slays all 7,000 of them. But, even though he had done that, Baal still emerged and reappeared since, the once should have been enough, but tragically it wasn't. And you do not pray for this people or lift up a cry or prayer for them, for I do not hear them in that time that they cry out to me because of their evil. So one of the ministries of the prophet was intercessory prayer. They prayed, they identified, they assumed the guilt of the nation with their their prayers. But, if he wasn't going to hear them, personally pray to him. So the priesthood of all believers means that we all have access We don't need an intermediary between us and him. The only priest is our sympathetic high priest in heaven. The office of institutional priesthood is abolished, yet it exists and flourishes in the Catholic Church and a few others, nevertheless. But, so we don't... the point is that we all have intimate access to him. That is what it means to be a priest, a believer, and a priest, in the priesthood of believers. Why should my beloved ones be in my house? She has done wickedness with many, and does the sacred flesh remove your evil from you. Then you rejoice. So the beloved ones is Judah, and the covenant is likened to a marriage. So right now, Yahweh feels like a husband whose wife, in the Israel is always depicted in the female role in the relationship of the covenant, has been violated by adultery and idolatry. They're closely connected, not just semantically. So they hoard about other gods, and they had cheated on their husband, who was the one of wrath, and he did not want them in their presence. And so their wickedness is with those around them, and eventually they did not keep themselves separate from the ways of the Gentile. And flesh cannot remove any evil from you. You need spiritual surgery. You need the incision, of which Jeremiah writes in the New Covenant chapter. He will give you a heart where the words of the law are written on it, and you'll be inclined to obedience. Yahweh has named you green olive tree, lovely or pleasant fruit. With the noise of a great sound, he has lit it on fire, and its branches shall be broken. So perhaps the more famous illustration of the olive branch is in Paul's 11th chapter to the Romans, but Israel is the olive branch, and Paul uses that about branches that can be grafted onto the vine in reference to the Gentile. But Jeremiah's emphasis is narrowly and introspectively on the nation of Israel, and they were supposed to be lovely and bear pleasant fruit, but their fruits became rotten. And, they're destined to be lit on fire. They are only fit for the fire in that state of irreversible iniquity, and the branches are going to be broken as sure as if anyone steps foot on them. And Yahweh of hosts, who planted you, has spoken evil against you for the evil of the house of Israel and of the house of Judah, which they have done against themselves to provoke me, by burning incense to all. So there's that rival again, Baal, the dangerous one, the one who was an annoying, pestilent presence in their land. They were the Canaanite fertile deity. Yahweh of hosts is his military name, so they sang the song to Yahweh the warrior in Exodus 15, and he's the one who planted, and he's the one who will uproot you. So to uproot someone is to translates as exile, and they had provoked him to uproot him. They had provoked the one who gave them and nourished them life by burning incense to Baal. They should have known better. They had the knowledge. They did not act on the knowledge. So we're going to wrap up this lesson here and save the other conspiracy, the conspiracy against his life, and try and connect it to the 12th chapter, or if possible. But that's all we're going to cover today. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.